Hey there everybody, Eric from Outer Limitless Blades coming at you today with a bit of a discussion which will probably have some level of controversy. Today I am going to talk to you about what, in my opinion, makes the quote-unquote best camp knife. Now I am going to premise this entire video by saying, first off, of course this is going to be my opinion. It's certainly up for debate, so I will encourage everybody to leave some comments below and make this a bit of a discussion because I think this is a really interesting and cool topic. Second is, keep in mind the fact that I am specifically talking about what makes a knife a great camp knife and the best overall camp knife for your general needs, not which knife is the best camp knife. I'm not picking any one particular model. More rather, what I'm talking about are the suite of different features that you can get in a knife that, when designed well and packaged together into one knife, makes it perform overall the best, gives you the best user experience, gives you the desired results while you're in the camping scenario. And the next thing I'm going to say is, well, as you take a look at all these blades here, most of them, if not all of them, fall somewhere between the 4 and 5 inch range. Now you could certainly make the argument that a larger knife is going to be a camp knife. I completely agree. You could also make the argument that a smaller knife is going to be a camp knife. I completely agree, but for today's discussion, I'm kind of finding us roughly in that between 4 and 5 inch blade size class, and more specifically for the reason that I find your typical user, and maybe anybody from a novice all the way through, your kind of more seasoned veteran, would naturally gravitate to a between 4 and 5 inch knife. The next thing I'm going to say is, of course, all of these are fixed blades. There are no folding knives in this particular collection. And there are a couple of knives in here that, from my experience and with my opinion, do come to the top of the list in terms of the closest you can get to combine all of the best elements into what truly is the best camp knife. And well, I'm going to pick on a few knives here as we go through this to really exemplify some of the great features that have come together into a suite of features that give you the overall best performance and user's experience. And I'm going to use the rest of the knives to demonstrate why those features really do work, and then the features on the rest of these knives that, in my opinion, don't work well for the quote-unquote best camp knife experience. And so, well, I can't help but do this, but I am going to pick heavily today on the Olive Knives Arbor. So as we get into this here, again, I'm going to kind of pick on this knife quite a bit. And when I say pick on it, I really am going to tell you, I'm going to point out all the amazing things about this particular knife and what comes together into an overall suite of features that really do exemplify excellence. Again, in my opinion, but I think I'll be able to clearly demonstrate why. And there are some other knives here that come, really damn close to, just so fantastic and just awesome in the hands. This here is a dark timber bushy. This here I have TRC, South Pole, just some awesome knives that check so many boxes, so many great makers here, and really that's what we're going to talk about. So first off, what are we using a camp knife for? So we kind of need to decide why we're using these knives in the first place, and when it comes to the camping experience, well, maybe you need a little bit of fire prep. You're trying to get your fire started. You have to process down some wood. Food prep. You're on the campsite. You gotta eat. And for me, having a knife that's going to perform those cooking tasks, absolutely required. Cutting cordage. Maybe you have to cut some packaging while you're out there. Maybe you have to pound in some tent stakes. Possibly you need to dig. You're gonna want to do some carving. Maybe you have to make yourself some tent pegs. You're going to be doing maybe some light chopping or light limbing. And then beyond all of that, well, you'd hate to say it, but maybe you need a little bit of self-defense. Bottom line is a camp knife needs to be both robust in its construction, yet slicey at the same time. So for me, there are some minimum requirements as we go through these, and we need to check some boxes. So a knife that's going to be robust and rugged construction. It's got to be made from durable materials. It has to be capable of cutting and effectively cutting in a number of different scenarios. It has to be trustworthy. You have to be able to trust it, so that strength and durability comes with that. Beyond everything, you have to have prolonged use in the hands. You can't beat up your hands when you're deep in the wilderness or in a camp environment. You have to have a knife that's going to preserve the quality of your hands as your main means of getting work done. And then beyond all of this too, you should have some level of being able to maintain your blades while you're in the field. So serviceability definitely does come into play. So as we get into the characteristics of a knife that I think really do lend themselves very well to the camp application. First off, the general blade shape. I do tend to like a drop point design or maybe a clip point, but things do start to get just a little bit difficult when you get into alternative blade shapes. Now, it's not to say that things are impossible, but there are trade-offs and definitely pros and cons to all of this. So the drop point design, very simple. You'll notice that the tip of the actual blade is relatively in line with the handle, so kind of like a spear-like shape. The next thing is, if you're going to be doing things like, say, for example, splitting of wood, and you want a baton down through the wood, a lot of times just having a simple drop point design works well, where you can crack down on top of the spine of the knife, and because the tip of the blade is not upswept, you don't get your baton caught on the tip of the knife, sometimes with a different shape. Like, for example, if you take a look at this Ontario knife here, you'll notice that that tip is upswept. And so what that means is if you're batoning down onto the tip of the blade, well, that, trailing point there can get caught and really inhibit your ability to actually baton down and through, and you'll actually beat up on your baton quite a bit. So that's just something worth considering. Now, I've even been guilty of designing knives like that as well. This is one of my designs. This is a Shanzhou Rhino camp knife and camp cleaver. And even though it's kind of designed to be a camp knife, there are times where batoning, this will absolutely get caught on that baton and, start to beat up on things. Now, that means you just need to work a little bit higher up on the tang and up towards, that thick steel. But you can't always do that, and especially depending on the size of the log that you're spanning. So, in my opinion, it does work just a little bit better to have something that's more like that drop point design. Now, another thing that works out very well, again, in my opinion, but that high saber grind. So the saber grind, having some of that full thickness of the stock partway down before you start your grind. And what that does is really give a shoulder for wood to split in that batoning scenario. So if you're pounding down and through the wood, that shoulder right there does allow the wood to split and then push past the top of the knife. Now, you could say, for example, what about a full flat grind? Well, here on this custom Swamp Rat, we have a couple of things that, granted a beautiful knife, awesome handle, but start to make this just a little more difficult. I mean, first off, you'll see that upswept tip, which again, back in the batoning makes that just a little bit difficult. But the second thing is that full flat grind creates the entire blade height worth of friction as you go to pound down and through the wood. So this will have less cracking action because you're not able to wedge the wood open. And as you're pounding this down and through, literally the wood binds the entire time right down that flat stock. So a full flat grind is definitely not as advantageous as that high saber grind. And different knives from different manufacturers will build that saber grind at a different height. You can see here on this TRC, that saber grind, I'm going to call that like a 4/5 height saber grind. That goes all the way up to a tiny little spot. Now, this still is a little more effective than a full flat grind. This has a lot of flat steel here. You'll see, I mean, how wide that flat section is. And so in reality, compared to some other designs, like I'll give you an example up against one of my designs. This is the TFK T17.5. You'll notice that it's more of that 2/3 height. There's kind of like a sweet spot between 2/3 and 3/4 height where you get the benefit of that grind being thin enough by the time you make it to your secondary bevel, but thick enough where it has that shoulder and can split the wood open. And this knife here is a little bit interesting, but this is a Hydra Knives white noise. Again, look at it's a saber grind, but that's like a 50% saber grind. So that means that this bevel coming down to that edge geometry is fairly thick. So that's going to be a broad edge, fairly thick. It's robust, don't get me wrong. I mean, this is a stout, tough knife, but that's going to be a broad edge. So it's going to take away some slicing capability, even though this thing will baton and split through wood like ease. And so another knife that, in my opinion, comes really close to that sort of perfect sweet spot geometry, this is the Reef Knives F5. The F5, just a gorgeous knife. Same with any of the F-series knives for that matter. You'll see that you end up with that just gorgeous high saber grind. You end up with it being roughly 3/4 of the way up. So you get that nice splitting and cracking action. But the interesting thing with the Reef knives, well, you end up with a slightly hollow ground primary bevel, which this goes the complete opposite direction from the Olive knives. So Olive, with that what they call Fibonacci grind, is kind of like a full convex edge. You'll notice as you take a look at that, it starts out wide and it comes down more like this until you get to the point. Whereas the Reef knives is hollow and it's more like this. So by the time you get to the edge of the grind and the back edge of your secondary bevel on that Olive knives arbor, it's kind of more like this. And again, the Reef knives, more like that. So the Reef knives is actually going to be a little bit slicier, but you're not going to blow the wood apart quite as easily in the batoning tasks. So these two knives really do strike a balance, but almost the opposite. One would be a little slicier and the other would baton a little bit better. The Olive knives is going to be a little more robust, but both of these fantastic options. Now, just to point out a couple of other knives with kind of a similar grind. This is one of my designs. This is the Shade Indonesia, again, Outer Limitless designed Inception 5. And the interesting thing about this is, and it's going to be a little bit hard to see, but you could probably see it. Your primary bevel here is a full convex, and that goes down to a 0 grind, which what that means is basically there is no secondary bevel. So your grind comes off of that high 2/3 saber grind. Again, it's going to be convex, so it kind of goes more like this. And as it comes down into that grind right down to the bottom, that is 0 ground. Again, there's no V grind on the bottom of this. So again, if you look at it next to the Olive knives, both of these conceptually very similar, yet on the Olive knives, that ends up with changing the angle on the grinder between stages and then all the way down to that shiny secondary bevel or V grind versus the belt and continuous curve and just smooth curve of this Inception 5 down to that 0 ground blade edge. So again, just giving you some general overall kind of similarities and differences, but things that I find are, in my opinion, very effective. I like the splitting capability overall of your more convex grind. I feel like you do get less overall binding going through the wood, and then especially through when you're talking about the batoning tasks.